Well, I thought it was high time I did another video on Aquinas' 5 ways of arguing for the existence of God. I believe you will find at least one video on the subject on this channel, but I think we need another one and hopefully a better one. Before getting into the 5 ways, let's do some brief introductory information on Aquinas and on the Summa Theologia. Aquinas is the medieval philosopher who's best known for integrating Aristotelian philosophical insights with Christian theology. If I were to draw a map of the history of Western thought, and I were only to include 5 things on it, here's how the 5 things might be placed. There's the Bible here, and there's Plato here. And the integration of Platonic philosophy with biblical thought, well, that's Augustine. Augustine's right here. But after Plato, there's his student Aristotle. So Bible here, Plato here, Aristotle over here. And the integration of Aristotle, biblical theology, is where you get Aquinas. Although Aquinas is also influenced by Augustine. So you'd have Bible, Plato, Aristotle, Bible, Plato, gives you Augustine. Bible, Aristotle, gives you Aquinas. But Aquinas is also drawing from Augustine rather a lot. I think in the Summa Theologia, in the Summa, I think he quotes Augustine more than anyone else. Well, I think he quotes the Bible more than anything else. And after that, I think he quotes Augustine more than anything else. And maybe Aristotle's in 3rd place. I've not actually counted the number of citations to different sources in the Summa. If anyone has done that, it was not I. But my impressions are he quotes the Bible the most, followed by Augustine, and after that, probably followed by Aristotle. But this is an extremely simplified picture. There's a lot more. This may be an oversimplification of Augustine, maybe an oversimplification of Aquinas. Certainly, it's leaving out a lot of other characters who are part of this rich, complex history. So anyway, Aquinas, as an extremely brief introduction, integrates some Aristotelian philosophy with some biblical theology. Now, this particular book, the Summa, could be understood as having 5 parts. These are the parts. You don't want to call them the 5 parts and use that as a proper term because, well, 2 of these parts are parts of the 2nd part. And one of these parts is a supplement to the 3rd part. So if you think of the Summa in 5 parts, that's fine. And here are the 5 parts. And on the newadvent.org, newadvent.org/Summa, public domain edition, here we have these 5 parts: prima pars, prima secundae partes, secunda secundae partes, tertia pars, supplementum tertia pars. But if you want to organize things in this way, this might be a little easier to keep track of. There's the prima pars, the 1st part, and then there's the 2nd part on ethics. And it's got 2 major parts. Then there's the 3rd part, which has a supplement. So if you like, you could think of it as having this big division, these 3 things, the prima pars, the 2nd part, and the 3rd part. And within that, this division of 5. Now let's keep things relatively simple. Let's talk about the 5. Well, let's not talk about the 5 in any more detail than we already have. Let's start with the 5 and work down. The 5 parts each have a series of questions. Now, this is the Latin word quaestio. In the plural, I believe it's quaestiones. So let's look at them all very briefly. How many questions? In the supplementum, 97 questions plus some appendices. 99. Tertia pars, 90. Secundae partes, 189. 108. Oh, 114. Where are we? We're now prima secundae. Now prima pars. Prima pars, 119. So there's a lot of these questions within each of the 5 parts. So there's the 5 parts, and there's a lot of questions within each part. But the Latin quaestio could mean inquiry or investigation. You might do better thinking of them as topics. Maybe inquiry is better as a functional English word that doesn't confuse you, plus decent translation of the Latin quaestio. Now, I say it doesn't confuse you because I hope it doesn't, because Within the questions, we have articles. So select this one at random. We have 8 articles within question 105 within the prima pars. But each article is itself a question. Whether God can move matter immediately to form. Whether God can move the created will. Whether one miracle is greater than another. These are questions using English. And there's one question per article, and there are 8 articles in this question, but that's quaestio. There's these 5 big parts, and then there's 90 something to 180 something quaestiones within each of these big parts. And each quaestio has a certain number of articles, maybe as few as 2, maybe in a few cases 1. Probably, I think sometimes they go as high as, I don't even know. I shouldn't even guess at the highest number, but the highest I think I have off the top of my head, maybe a little over 10. I think in the one, I think the first one, you have a relatively high number. 10 in the first one. So 2 to 10 is a fairly good estimate for what you will often see. So there's the 5 big parts. Within them, there's 90 something to 180 something quaestiones. Within each quaestio, there is a certain number of articles. Each article has one question using the English question. And here in this edition, try not to be confused by the fact that there's one question per article, but multiple articles per question. But that question is just one of the reasonable English translations of the Latin quaestio, but inquiry might be another way of thinking through that. Now, let's zoom in on the articles. Now, actually, let's go to where we are today. We are looking at the 5 ways of proving the existence of God. Now, that's in the prima pars. And that's specifically in quaestio 2, on the existence of God, and specifically within quaestio 2, article 3, whether God exists. Now, within each article, Aquinas proceeds in a dialectical format. Do not think that this is quite the same thing as Hegelian dialectic. And by the way, it's suddenly occurring to me that I didn't remember to zoom in on the text I was highlighting in my Microsoft Word document here. So I apologize if this has not been clear. I'm zooming in as of now. And if you need to look at the text with some zooming in, you can pause the video and review this bit. Pause the video and review this bit. And now let's get to, in the articles, Aquinas proceeds in a dialectical fashion, dialectical manner. He asks a question. That's the question that is the topic of the article. He asks whether God exists in this case. Then he gives reasons someone might answer the question a certain way. These are called the objections. Then he gives a reason to answer the question a different way. This is the on the contrary. Then he gives his own answer, signified by I answer that. Then he responds to the objections. If necessary, he may sometimes respond to the on the contrary. So here, whether God exists, that's the question. Here are 2 objections. These are reasons someone might answer the question in a particular way. The objections are always wrong. The objections are reasons a person might answer the question in a certain mistaken way. The on the contrary is some sort of an opposite view to the objections. It's not always correct, but it often is, and in this case, it is. Here, then, is the question whether God exists. Here are the objections, 2 reasons someone might say God does not exist. 2 reasons, in fact, people do say that God does not exist. Then, a contrary position drawn from the testimony of Scripture to the effect that God exists. Then Aquinas gives his own answer, arguing with 5 different arguments that God does, in fact, exist. Then he responds to the objections. So these are the replies. This is the I answer that. There's a short on the contrary. There's a certain number of objections. And the number of objections varies somewhat. Sometimes it's well over 2. Okay, so this is the approach. The 5 ways then. Let's look at the text. Now, we are looking at what is probably the most famous passage in Aquinas, at least these days, the 5 ways of proving the existence of God. Each of the 5 ways is an argument that starts with an observation from human experience, something which is plain to the senses, in fact, and moves from there to the conclusion that what we call God exists. Now, one possible objection to this approach is, in fact, a mistake, and you should probably just not make it. Here's the objection. Maybe Aquinas does prove that something called God exists, but that's a long way from proving the existence of the God of the Bible and all the other stuff in Christian theology. Well, yeah, it is a long way from proving all the other stuff in Christian theology. It's not quite the same thing as proving the God of the Bible. Aquinas knows, okay? He's not stupid. He's smarter than you, and he's smarter than I am. Aquinas is giving evidence that God exists in this particular article, which is one of 3 articles on Christio 2, on the existence of God, topic, investigation, inquiry 2, which is one of 119 Questiones in the Prima Pars, which is one of these 5 major sections of the Summa. You want to see his arguments that specifically the God who exists is the God in the Bible, and that specifically Christian theology is the correct account of this God. Read the rest of the Summa. What we're doing here is just looking at his 5 ways of proving just the proposition that some sort of God exists. Well, not some sort of God, the perfect being, in fact. The greatest possible being. Now, this is Anselmian language that may not fit in this part of the Summa. What language does fit? A necessary being. He's trying to prove that God exists, a higher being, a necessary being, a creator being, and a first cause, and an uncaused cause. Now, let's look at the 5 ways. Now, I don't think I'm going to read these or comment on the arguments themselves in any detail. You may, at your leisure, if you're so inclined, stop and read them. You may want to pause the video. We have the argument for motion. I recommend you pause the video and read it. We have the argument from efficient cause. I recommend you pause the video and read it. We have the argument from possibility and necessity. Again, I recommend pausing. We have the somewhat Platonic argument from gradation, and the argument from teleology, of which a term definition of which I give in parentheses. Now, what about these arguments? Now, I'm actually not going to, not only am I not going to read the arguments for you, you can read this for yourself, pausing the video, I presume. Oh, if there's any difficulty reading the text, I don't know, maybe you're on a smartphone, maybe the video recording is not the highest quality, the text is too small, I didn't zoom in enough, I don't know. Email platoandaugustine@gmail.com, platoandaugustine@gmail.com, and ask me for a text copy of this information, and I can email it to you. All right, let's not analyze the arguments one at a time, and moreover, I don't think I'm going to give any further commentary on these 2 arguments. I want to talk about the 3 cosmological arguments. A cosmological argument for the existence of God is an argument that argues that God must exist because of something about cause and effect. We see cause, we see effect, and the only sufficient explanation for these things is that there is a God, a first cause. Now, let's first observe what 3 possibilities you can try when you observe that there are causes and effects. Let's look at me. I exist because my parents caused me. They existed because their parents caused them. Their parents existed because their parents caused them, and this repeats a lot. But it doesn't go on into infinity. Well, allegedly. Let's talk about that. There are 3 ways you could explain this chain of cause and effect. I exist because of them. They exist because of some other people who exist because of some other people. And it keeps going for a long time. It could go on into infinity. Or it might get to something that caused itself, something that created itself and then created everything else. Or at least it created itself and then set in motion this chain of cause and effect that eventually got to me. So the infinite regress, or maybe it just goes back for a long time and then starts with something that caused itself and then set in motion this whole chain of cause and effect. Or there is an uncaused cause at the beginning, something that did not cause itself, but did cause this whole chain of cause and effect. Something that does not have a cause, but did cause everything else. Now that's the Aquinas idea. That's in fact God. God is the uncaused cause. And the arguments, these three cosmological arguments Aquinas uses here, are arguing that this uncaused cause must exist because the alternatives don't make sense. First, the cause of itself would be self-contradictory. Nothing is a cause of itself. Nothing sets itself in motion. There's no such thing as a cause of itself. And actually, I think in this third argument, because Aquinas is dealing with a slightly different line of reasoning. In this third argument, he may not specifically address the cause of itself, because I think he's already ruled it out here at step 5 of the argument. But anyway, I'm getting bogged down in details. I didn't want to get bogged down in. When you're dealing with a cosmological argument on the model of these from Aquinas, there are cosmological arguments on different models, like the famous Kalam cosmological argument. That's K-A-L-A-M. But when you're dealing with cosmological arguments like these from Aquinas, here's the approach. You could say there's an uncaused cause. You could say something caused itself. You could say there's an infinite regress. But the cause of itself is self-contradictory, so it can't be that. Why is it self-contradictory? Because in order for it to cause itself, it must have not existed so that it could then cause itself. It must have not existed so that it could be able to be caused. But it also must have existed in order to be able to cause itself. So it must have existed and not existed. So this is a rubbish idea. There's no such thing as the cause of itself. Now, the infinite regress explains nothing. We'll get into that in a moment. Let's make sure we're clear on what the options are. Your only options when you're dealing with a chain of cause and effect, I'm caused by my parents, we're caused by their parents, caused by their parents, and repeat, hundreds of times, thousands of times, millions of times, maybe billions of times, but eventually you're either going to reach all the way back into infinite past and infinite regressive causes, or you're going to find something that caused itself, or something that was an uncaused cause, a first cause, but not itself caused. The uncaused cause is correct because a cause of itself is self-contradictory, and because an infinite regressive causes explains nothing. More on that shortly. Let's try to clarify the idea of the uncaused cause. Let's make sure our heads are wrapped around this idea as well as they can be. What you must not do is ask the question, what caused God, or who created God? Nothing caused God. Nothing created God. God is not caused. God was not created. We are talking here about the uncaused cause, or the first cause, or the necessary being. These are just different ways of phrasing the same idea. God, as the uncaused cause, is that which causes other things, but is not itself caused. Now, it is the explanation for its own existence. God is the explanation for his own existence. And that is why God is able to explain other things. Or you might say God contains. God contains the explanation for his own existence, and that's why he's able to explain other things. God explains himself, or God is self-explained, self-defining. Or maybe we should just say, the first cause needs no other explanation. It did not make or create itself. That's rubbish. That would be the cause of itself. That's self-contradictory. And it's not created by anything else because it's the first cause. It's the uncaused cause. It is not just the cause of what we see in the world. That's not the point. That's not cosmological arguments. I don't know if anyone makes an argument like that, but it's not Aquinas. I don't think it's anyone I've ever heard of. When people ask, but who created God? They're just completely missing the point of a cosmological argument, entirely missing the point. If a cosmological argument can successfully establish the existence of a first cause, then what it has established is not just something that created the world, but might well have needed its own cause. No, it has established that which is an uncaused cause, of which it is folly to ask what caused it. Nothing caused the uncaused cause, any more than a circle has 90-degree angles. It's by definition uncaused. It did not make or create itself. But you may say it has an explanation. If you seek an explanation, well, you might get at least a partial answer. Maybe not one you can fully comprehend, because we're dealing with a reality beyond us. But at any rate, something that does have an explanation is what we're talking about. And you might be able to get at least a partial understanding of this. At least understand this. The idea of the first cause is the idea of a being which has an explanation for its own existence, or which you could say is an explanation for its own existence, because it is the necessary being. It is the being who contains within himself the necessity of his own existence. So don't ask what caused God. Don't speculate about the cause of the first cause. If you were speculating about the cause of something, then what you're speculating about is that this something is not a first cause. But if we're really talking about the first cause, and if the arguments can successfully prove that there is such a thing, what we are talking about has no cause. But you may ask not what created it, but you may ask, what is the explanation for it? The explanation is itself. It is the necessary being. That's what a first cause is. It's not something that randomly exists. No, it's something that contains within itself the explanation for its own existence. It is the necessary being. That's the God we're talking about. Now, what we want to do in the remainder of this video is get a working understanding of why Aquinas thinks an infinite regress of causes explains nothing. The main point of watching this video, main point of recording this video, if there is any use of this video at all, it was probably just to get this across. But if there were 2 points, I hope this is the second one. This is what motivates me to explain it, to make this video. To try to explain this is what really motivated me to make this video. And I confess I have erred in the past. I have stood in front of students and given them this normal way of thinking through these arguments. There is one very normal but mistaken way of thinking through the cosmological arguments here, which is to say those first 3 of the 5 ways. That mistake is to think that Aquinas rejects the infinite regress on the grounds that it would be an actual infinity, which would supposedly be impossible because it would be self-contradictory. Now, there's a lot to try to keep track of here. I have, as I said, made the mistake of presenting Aquinas in these terms. I'm sorry if any of my former students who ever heard me say this catch this video. I'm sorry I was not thinking about this correctly myself. I hope I didn't ruin your life and some bad information about Aquinas. But let's try to do better. This is my best understanding of how these cosmological arguments work, with particular attention to why an infinite regress of causes explains nothing. I'm going to explain in just a little bit of detail this idea, the idea of the actual infinite, some of the issues, and then I'm going to give a correct account of what's going on. This is one reason some people think Aquinas thinks this. Aquinas thinks an infinite regress of causes explains nothing. This is the reason some people think he thinks that. This is a mistake. This is not why he thinks that. I'll tell you why he thinks that when I get to letter C. Here we are on letter B. Let's look at letter B very briefly. An actual infinity means an infinite number of distinct things. And we mean an actual infinite, not a potential infinite. So I could start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and I could keep going. And there's no upper limit where I have to stop. There's no rule that says I have to stop at 1,000,002. No, I could keep going. But there's never going to be a time when I reach an infinite number of numbers I've actually counted. That time will never happen. I could keep going into what we could call a potential infinity because there's no specific upper limit on how high I can count. But I will never count to infinity. Even if I kept counting for all eternity, I would never reach an infinite number of numbers I had counted. Hilbert's hotel is a thought experiment, which is a nice illustration of the alleged idea that an actually infinite number of distinct things is impossible. Wait, let's clarify infinite number of distinct things. It is often thought, I dare say Aquinas himself thinks it, that God is an infinite being in some sense. God, for example, perhaps could be said to have infinite goodness or infinite wisdom. Well, that doesn't mean God is an actual infinity in any way that would be self-contradictory. That means God is a single whole with an infinite proportion of some particular quality. God has infinite wisdom, but God is one being, not an infinite number of distinct things. When we're talking about an actual infinity, we're talking about an infinite number of distinct things and an actual infinite number of distinct things, not a potential one. Why is this idea problematic? Hilbert's hotel is a traditional illustration. I think to keep this video to a relatively manageable length, I will not actually go over the Hilbert's hotel illustration for you. You can probably find Hilbert's hotel on the internet, and let it suffice to say that the illustration of Hilbert's hotel is meant to show you how the idea of an actual infinite number of hotel rooms leads to a contradiction, which is to say it must be a false idea. Whatever idea leads to a contradiction must be false. So there's a lot of people who've said the idea of an actual infinite is crazy. It's impossible. It doesn't make any sense. It leads to contradiction. They say that Georg Cantor proved them wrong. They say that Georg Cantor proved that the idea of an actual infinity actually makes sense. So Cantor is a great mathematician. I don't know this. Maybe I should update this. No, we're still at about 1 century ago for Cantor. Anyway, he did some clever work dealing with the idea of an actual infinity, and some say that he proved that the idea actually does make sense. If that's the case, if that is the case, that would disprove Aquinas. I apologize if I said I'll get to the correct account of Aquinas arguments when I get to letter C. No, I'm going to get to the correct account when we get to letter D. Or rather, let's keep it at letter C. When I get to letter C, I'll get to the correct account. There we go. So the idea of an actual infinity is this idea, an infinite number of distinct things, an actual infinite, not a potential one. It's allegedly a contradictory idea, an idea that doesn't make any sense. Many people have thought so. Georg Cantor supposedly proved them wrong. If that's the case, then Cantor would disprove Aquinas' arguments, which does not mean that there's no hope of arguing for the existence of God. It would just mean you need to try some different arguments, maybe some different cosmological arguments. The Kalam cosmological argument is immune to this particular objection. But fortunately, as far as I can tell, so is Aquinas. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that when we get to letter C. I do want to mention parenthetically, as someone who's never studied Cantor, I don't want to say anything about this. I know nothing I can say. Some say that Cantor did not actually prove this. I'm quite serious when I say I don't know anything. Hopefully I know what I don't know. The wisdom of Confucius, and the wisdom of Socrates. I do know that my homeboy Andrew Loke in this book will address this issue, and that you can look up this book if you like. Also, this is a good book on a Kalam cosmological argument, if you're interested in that sort of thing. But sticking now with Aquinas cosmological arguments, they say that he's dealing with the idea that an actual infinite would be impossible, and therefore the infinite regressive causes doesn't work, and that Cantor would have proved that Aquinas' arguments are a dismal failure because he has a false premise ruling out the actual infinite. But some say Cantor didn't prove that, and I say I don't care as far as Aquinas goes, because all of this is missing the point. In fact, sorely tempted to just X out everything, because this is not what Aquinas is talking about. Trying to give you a working understanding of what is a normal understanding of Aquinas, maybe because it's interesting, but more importantly, so that we can get past it. Know an error so that you can move on from it. That's what we're dealing with here. This is not the right way to interpret Aquinas, but let's keep it so we can know the error. Let's not X out the text. Keep the text. What's really going on here? Aquinas thinks that infinite regressive causes explains nothing. Now let's try to understand why that is. And it is not about the impossibility of an actual infinite. What it is about is the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason tells us that everything has an explanation. Aquinas thinks that a true explanation does not exist unless it starts somewhere. Now let me try to explain this. If you stop here and only know this, that Aquinas has a particular understanding of a principle in metaphysics we call the principle of sufficient reason, and that according to his understanding of the principle of sufficient reason, an explanation must begin somewhere. If you understand that, you'll be doing pretty well. You will know why Aquinas thinks an infinite regress of causes explains nothing. If I'm caused by my parents and they're caused by their parents or caused by their parents and so on into infinity, if that's the case, the explanation doesn't begin anywhere. It's an infinite chain of causes. If that's the case, the explanation doesn't begin anywhere. And if this way of understanding the principle of sufficient reason is correct, then an infinite regress explains nothing. That's why these arguments are the way they are. That's why Aquinas thinks we must have a first cause. If you think in these terms and stop there, that's fine. You're doing well. You're doing better than many. You're doing better probably than most in understanding Aquinas. But let's do a little better. Let's do a little better if we can. Let me try to explain why a true explanation does not make sense unless it starts somewhere, at least according to Aquinas. Let's say what is in fact true. I exist because my parents caused me. The explanation for my existence is not actually my parents, because they were also caused. So I'm not fully explained, am I? If you just point out that my parents caused me. That's part of the explanation. I exist because my parents existed. Sure, that's correct. But that doesn't explain everything. That doesn't give a full explanation for my existence, because they are contingent beings. They also need an explanation. If they need an explanation for their existence, and if their existence is a necessary part of the explanation for my existence, then the explanation for my existence has not yet been given by looking at my parents. Now, let's stipulate there's an infinite regress. I'm caused by them, they're caused by their parents, blah, 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 so on into infinity. Every single link in the chain has the same problem. My parents are not a full explanation of me, precisely because they're necessary to explain my own existence. Just for that very reason, it is the case that my existence is not explained by them. They are necessary to explain my own existence. But for the same reason, since they also need an explanation for their own existence, they cannot explain my existence, not completely. They're part of the explanation, but not the whole explanation. They cannot explain my own existence if they also need an explanation for their existence. And what is true of them is true of the ones who came before them, my grandparents, and it's true of their parents, and that's true of their parents too. And as far back as the chain goes, every item in the chain fails to explain what comes after it. It is a part of the explanation, but it does fail fully to explain what comes after it. And if that's true of every item in the chain, then there's no explanation anywhere in the chain. It's an infinitely long chain. Explanation must come from somewhere. It doesn't come from my parents. The explanation for my existence comes through my parents, but not from them. There is no true explanation unless it comes from somewhere. That, my friends, is why God must exist according to Aquinas' arguments. The first cause, keep in mind, has an explanation, because it is the explanation for itself. God, the first cause, is the necessary being. Everything else has an explanation from outside of itself, but ultimately deriving from God. God has an explanation, but not an external explanation. God is his own explanation. That's what Aquinas is talking about. I strongly recommend reading some Aquinas. Aquinas is awesome. This particular set of arguments is a mere 5 paragraphs, but I do advise reading more. Oh my goodness, I didn't comment on the objections. Let's fill in a few more observations on the text. The objections are plausible arguments that God does not exist. The first argument is an argument from evil. It's a problem of evil argument. Clever people on the internet these days who say, God does not exist because there's evil. If God exists, why would there be so much suffering in the world? Yeah, Aquinas thought about that argument. You didn't discover that for the first time. If you did discover the argument, I suppose good for you, but you weren't the first. Aquinas had been dealing with this argument a long time before either of us came along. He gives this problem of evil argument against the existence of God. Remember, the objections are always mistakes. Maybe there's an insight. There's something to be learned from them, that they are, in fact, mistakes. There's always something to be learned from them. That's part of why he goes over them. Even if it were just that they are mistakes, that's something to be learned from them. But there's often more than that. Anyway, he gives a problem of evil argument. Then he gives a parsimony argument. If you don't know the word, it's P-A-R-S-I-M-O-N-Y, parsimony. Or you could just think of it as an Occam's razor argument. Here he says God does not exist because if God is infinite good, then there would be no evil. There is evil, therefore God does not exist. And here he gives the Occam's razor argument. Everything can be explained by nature or by human will. Therefore, there's no need to say that God exists. Then, on the contrary, God does exist according to the scriptures. I answer that the existence of God can indeed be demonstrated rationally. Here are 5 ways of doing so. Then he replies to the objections, and okay, guess what? When Aquinas got to the problem of evil, he was already old-fashioned. Augustine had been dealing with the problem of evil a long time before Aquinas. Centuries before Aquinas, Augustine had given his response to the problem of evil, which Aquinas now endorses as his reply to objection 1. And he also gives a reply to objection 2. So there's a brief introduction to more of the reading. I recommend reading Article 3 of Question 2, Quaestio 2, on the existence of God. Also, I recommend reading, if you have time, ability, and inclination, more of the Summa. I will make a confession, I've not read the whole Summa. Do some good reading, great philosophy, great theological works. Do as much as you can. Good luck. Thanks for watching.